نجيب ستار نحطه هون المرة الجاي. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. So last time we looked at the muqata'a, the boycotting of the Ummah, and how that went down, derived some of the lessons, including how it is part of the development of an Ummah that the Ummah is besieged, boycotted, and how we see that going on in our times today. Also how the lifting of the boycott did not happen exclusively through the efforts of Muslims. It was actually collaboration and through the political activism, if you want to call it that, of non-Muslims, of Quraysh, who felt the cause and was sympathetic with the cause, and they assisted it and broke the boycott. And how in our times today, we need to work with people who sympathize with what's going on and see the nonsense of what's going on to try and break the siege of Palestine, or Gaza, and the West Bank, and what's going on over there. Now, after the boycott, you have the year of sorrow or sadness, Am al-Huzun, that affected the Prophet ﷺ. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, every time He sent a prophet from within a strong tribe. Hud, came from a noble tribe. Salih came from a noble tribe. In fact, his people told him, قالوا يا صالح قد كنت فينا مرجوا قبل هذا. Meaning that they were saying, we were considering you to be the leader, to be the sheikh of the qabila, of the tribe. Same thing with Shu'aib. They came from stronger tribes, and that of the Prophet ﷺ, Banu Hashim. They are a strong, noble tribe. And the question is why? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used that tribe to protect the Prophet. Because as we've gone over before, the tribal system, right? It works in a way where I could disagree with somebody from my tribe, but I have a lot of responsibility in protecting them, right? So the same thing here. Abu Talib was the chief of Quraysh while alive, and the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, and he served as the Prophet's political shield. Quraysh could not harm the Prophet because that would be war against Bani Hashim, against the tribe of Hashim. They couldn't do it. So that's how the Prophet ﷺ was able to give the da'wah with only minor harassment in comparison to other companions like Bilal, like Khabbab, and others who were tortured. They were tortured because they came from weaker, vulnerable tribes. So the elites of Quraysh were able to get away with it. They couldn't do that to the Prophet ﷺ because Abu Talib was protecting him. But Abu Talib dies, passes away, and passes away as a disbeliever, as a kafir. Right? And as he was passing away in the final moments, you had the Prophet ﷺ, and you had Abu Lahab, Abu Jahl, and another of the mujrimeen of Quraysh, the criminals of Quraysh, each one trying to convince Abu Talib to follow their religion. The Prophet ﷺ would tell him, say La ilaha illallah. Right? I can defend you on the day of judgment. I can speak for you on the day of judgment if you say this. And Abu Jahl would respond and say, will you leave the way of your father? And you had that, and Abu Talib dies. He says, I die on the religion of my father, Abdul Muttalib. So that happens, he passes away, and now the Prophet ﷺ is vulnerable. He is vulnerable. And on top of that, in the same year, it said within 3 months, his wife Khadija, radiallahu ta'ala anha, passes away as well. And some say that she passed away because of the boycott. During the boycott, she got very ill, and it seems like that might have led to her passing away. And Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha was the Prophet's social support, and his emotional support, and his financial support. It was through her networks, as we discussed last time, through her network, she was able to bring in some food from her business partners, right? Calling in favors. She did that. She used all her money on the da'wah of the Prophet ﷺ. And whenever the Prophet was feeling down, he would go to her, radiallahu ta'ala anha. So the Prophet loses all of his support, his meaningful support. He loses it within months of each other. And now what is he forced to do? He's vulnerable. He's forced to look for protection. So every time people would come from Hajj, he would start doing his da'wah, seeing if there's somebody who would bring him in. And then he does the unthinkable, at least to Quraysh. He goes to At-Ta'if. Why is that unthinkable? Because At-Ta'if were rivals of Quraysh. They were on the same page. These aren't their friends. And as a tribes person, you go to the enemy to get protection, that's big. That's big. So the Prophet ﷺ is taking a major risk that he knows if it does not go as he planned is a big problem, huge problem. But he goes. What can he do? Imagine Abu Bakr is there, Umar is there, Hamza is there, Umar ibn Khattab is there, Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhum jami'an. They're all there. Yet despite the presence of who we see as the best and the greatest and the most powerful people, he had to look elsewhere. And where did he go? Another disbelieving tribe. He goes to At-Ta'if, and we know the story. Okay? And they reject him, and they mock him, and they harass him, and they oust him. And then he goes down the mountain, and then this is where I want us to focus on today. What the Prophet's reaction was, alayhi salatu wasalam, when he was sitting at the foothills of the mountain, and he was getting rest, and with him was Ammar ibn Yasir. Ammar was with him. Ammar ibn Yasir. And the Jibreel alayhi salam comes to the Prophet and says, Ya Rasulullah, with me here is the angel of the mountains. Give him the word, and he'll cause the mountains to collapse. A lot of people misunderstand this to think collapse on At-Ta'if. No, what's meant is Quraysh. Because it was Quraysh that put him in a position where he needed to go elsewhere. So the angel, Jibreel alayhi salam, said, we can cause the mountains around Mecca to collapse on Mecca. And what did the Prophet respond, alayhi salatu wasalam? No, perhaps somebody from their descendants or their descendants will say, La ilaha illallah. And here is a lesson for us today. In a time when people harass us and bully us and nothing seems to be going our way, what is our reaction to that? A lot of people end up developing hiqd, resentment, animosity, hatred, blind blanket statements. All these people are terrible. I will never work with anybody. All these people are evil. Nobody cares about us. These blanket generalized statements that really reflect that the inside of the individual saying this has been crushed. There's little hope. There's little light in their hearts. I don't mean that in terms of iman. I mean that in terms of emotionally speaking. And that's not the way of the Prophet ﷺ. Despite this probably being the lowest point in the Prophet ﷺ's life, he was able to muster the compassion and the rahmah, the mercy, and the optimism and hope for a better future, even though he had the ability to crush his enemies. Now let's be real, let's be honest. If we had the ability to snap our fingers and Israel just goes away, I'd be the first to do it. I'd be the first to do it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the point here is, what is going on inside while we see what's going on outside? What's going on? Do we develop a hatred, an ugly, devilish hatred that makes us as potentially evil as those who we criticize? When you look at Israel, all of their propaganda revolves around two or three things. The main one being, we're at an existential threat. Look at the Holocaust. Everybody hates us. They're all coming after us, and so we have to defend ourselves. It's like the ugliness that they experienced in the Holocaust turned them into the same people they used to be oppressed by. Why? Well, they didn't regulate their emotions. Isn't it absolutely appalling that when the refugees came from the Holocaust, on their ships, and we all seen the pictures. Please don't turn us away. Please don't shoot at us coming into Palestine. They end up picking up the guns and attacking a people who have nothing to do with it. And you know the statement, people tend to become their own worst enemies? That could happen to anybody. That could have happened to the Prophet ﷺ, وحاشا, ﷺ. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us who this man really is. He's not a man out for himself. He's not a man out with a vengeance. He's not a man who events dictate who he is. Rather, what dictates who he is what pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In his mind, alayhi salatu wasalam, what would Allah want? Would he want to see the demise of a people? Is Allah there to crush these civilizations? And when Allah crushed and destroyed Ad and Thamud and Fir'aun and the people of Lut and the people of Shu'aib, did Allah do that and it brought him satisfaction? وَحَاشَ لِلَّهِ. Well, Allah did it because there was no other way. Subhanah. So the Prophet ﷺ was able to remain noble by retaining the mercy, retaining the compassion. What is more pleasurable to us? And I know people might be uneasy at what I'm about to say. What is more pleasing to us? The destruction of Israel or those people becoming Muslim? Do they deserve it? That's one thing. We don't argue here. But what would the Prophet want, alayhi salatu wasalam? What would the Prophet want? When he looks and sees that, what would he choose? Quraysh was the same thing? Now, again, don't misunderstand me. I'm talking about the emotions. How we deal with them, that's a whole different story. I'm not saying turn the other cheek. We don't play that game. Those who want to play tough, we're going to play tougher. Those who want to cause harm, we as Muslims must put them in place. But while we do that, what's in our hearts? We do this out of hatred, out of vengeance, or we do because we're approaching justice. When the Prophet ﷺ spoke to Ali before sending him to a battle, he said, لَإِنْ يَهْدِيَ اللَّهُ بِكَ رَجُلًا خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنْ حُمْرِ النَّعَمِ. Allah wishes to guide one person on your hand, it is better than a lot of money, all the spoils. What is the Prophet ﷺ teaching here? When they're going out in their maghazi, their futuhat, when they're going and getting spoils of war, that can easily corrupt their intention by thinking, you know what, I want to defeat them to take their money. That becomes the goal. So the Prophet balances that out by saying there's more to gain by them becoming believers than by you taking their money. Right? And again, please don't misunderstand me. We need to deal with them the way they behave. But while we do that, we retain that prophetic nature. The Prophet could have destroyed Quraysh by the command, and they would have deserved it. Had they not deserved it, Allah would not have given him the option. But he chose elsewhere. He chose something else, right? I'm not saying that's what we do today. All I'm saying is, what do we have in our hearts? Hatred? Or we retain the prophetic mercy while doing what we are commanded to do by Allah and stopping the fasad and stopping the injustices, right? So the Prophet ﷺ says, perhaps from their descendants will come believers. And Allah honored that moment by doing precisely that. Quraysh became believers. Not only that, when all of Arabia apostated from Islam, Quraysh and At-Ta'if were of the 3 cities that remained on Islam. Had they been destroyed, maybe the apostate wars would have ended very differently. Medina, Mecca, and Ta'if were the 3 cities that remained in Islam after the death of the Prophet, while all of the rest of Arabia apostated. Right? And then after that, the Prophet ﷺ says a very well-known dua. Now, the scholars say that the hadith itself that narrates this dua is weaker, but nonetheless, we can learn some lessons from it. The Prophet ﷺ says, Allahumma inni ashku ilayka ضعف قوتي وقلة حيلتي وهواني على الناس. The Prophet makes a dua and says, Oh Allah, I complain to you the weakness of my strength and my inability to navigate this terrain, and how people see me as weak. This is the Prophet, والسلام, who we see as the most noble, the strongest, the most courageous, and rightfully so. Yet there was a moment where the Prophet والسلام, felt very weak, felt unable to do anything. He had no ability. And he felt like people saw him as weak and nothing. And this is precisely how Muslims feel today. This is precisely how we feel. We have so many people across the globe. We have so much money, so many smart people, so many degrees, so many doctors and PhDs and lawyers and engineers and everything. Khair Allah. Yet we feel so weak. And despite all of our resources, it almost seems meaningless. It almost seems meaningless. And people look at us and we're just a joke. That's how it is. And that's very difficult on a person. Wallahi, it's very difficult. But it's reassuring to know that at a moment, despite the Prophet being the most noble, والسلام, he felt this way. So that if and when we feel at a low point, we get inspiration from the Prophet والسلام. أشكو إليك ضعف قوتي وقلة حيلتي وهواني على الناس أنت أرحم الراحمين ورب المستضعفين وأنت ربي. Then Allah, the Prophet reminds himself of who Allah is. And he invokes Allah through his names and his attributes. You are the most merciful. You are the most merciful. You are the Lord of the weak. Subhanah. He is the Lord of the weak. And he is my Lord. Ibn al-Qayyim rahmatullah alayh says something very powerful, very beautiful. He says, if you find yourself in a situation of weakness and difficulty and pain, but that situation is causing you to make dua to Allah, then he says, Wallahi dhalika aynun ni'mah. He says, Wallahi, that is the true blessing. That is the true blessing. Because that situation is being used to get you closer to Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala. To get you closer to Allah. And here you have this happening with the Prophet ﷺ. And the fact of the matter is, when we feel weak, that is when we reach out to Allah. So to a believer, al-iftiqar, need, when it is sent or directed to Allah, that is the source of strength of the believer. Al-iftiqar ilallah. So if Allah puts you through situations that tells you and shows you and exposes to you your weaknesses and your vulnerabilities, to where you feel that, and then you feel more dependent and needing of Allah, that is the strength of the believer. And this is precisely what's happening to the Prophet ﷺ. And this is what's happening to the Ummah today, if we learn how to direct it properly. Because if a person starts using that to depend on other than Allah, no, that's a problem. That's not what we want. That's not the point here. But the best dua is a dua that comes when we feel weak and vulnerable. أَمَّا يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَ إِذَا دَعَاهُ. وَالْإِضْطِرَارُ. This need comes when? When you are in a very, very, very difficult situation. You have nowhere to go, nothing that you can do. You've tried everything. All the doors are closed. You have none but Allah. So you reach out to Allah. That is the heart from which a powerful dua will come out, and Allah will answer that dua in ways that's truly phenomenal. So the ayah continues, أَمَّا يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ وَيَجْعَلُكُمْ خُلَفَاءَ الْأَرْضِ. Allah answers a dua, removes your difficulty. Not only that, He makes you khulafa fil ard. What does that mean? He means that after your situation of difficulty, Allah will put you in a stronger position afterwards. And that's precisely what happens soon after the Prophet ﷺ makes this dua. Because it's only about a year and a half later, who comes on the scene? The Ansar. The Ansar. Preparing the Prophet ﷺ for the next phase, the phase of stability and khilafah and strength and unity and independence. It's as though the Prophet had to go through this moment to make that dua, to open the doors for what would be the next phase. So when we go through what we're going through today, part of Allah's plan is to make you feel pain, to make you feel vulnerable, to make you feel frustrated, so that you make dua, so that the doors of the next phase are open for you, and so that your dua is answered. And then the Prophet says, إِلَى مَنْ تَكِلُنِي إِلَى قَرِيبٍ يَتَجَهَّمُنِي أَوْ إِلَى بَعِيدٍ مَلَّكْتَهُ أَوْ إِلَى عَدُوٍ مَلَّكْتَهُ أَمْرِي. Here the Prophet ﷺ, where do I go from here? I mean, if you just, maybe you have a moment in your life where you said, where do I go? Where can I go? Everything seems closed in front of me. The Prophet says, I have two options. Ta'if, who are a Ba'id, they're like foreign to me, they're a distant tribe, they're not my people. And if a foreigner is in another people's land, what do they do to them? They become the servants. Yeah, you're going to serve us. You're lesser, you're inferior. So the Prophet ﷺ says, أَوْ إِلَىٰ عَدُوٍ مَلَّكْتَهُ أَمْرِي. They become in control of me by merit of me being a foreigner. Will you leave me with them, a Ta'if? Or will you leave me with a Qarib, my relatives, Quraysh, who are behaving the way you see them as behaving? Where do I go? وَلَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. This is the Prophet ﷺ. So when it happens to us, we hope it never happens to us, but when it happens, if it happens to us, we get the strength by knowing that, well, it happened to the Prophet ﷺ. And that these scenarios are not a sign of Allah upset, that Allah is upset with a people or a person, but rather it could be part of that greater plan for the next phase. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. إِن لَمْ يَكُنْ بِكَ عَلَيَّ غَضَبٌ فَلَا أُبَالِي. This is the next lesson. Oh Allah, if you're not mad at me, then whatever happens, happens. It doesn't really matter. It's irrelevant. See, the Prophet ﷺ was able to tell the angel of the mountains, no, don't crush them, because the Prophet wasn't working for himself. It wasn't about him. If it was about him, he would have just crushed them. Right? But he was working for a greater cause. He was working for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his pleasure. He was working to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so if this happens and Allah is not upset with me, then I'm reaching my goal. My goal is still in place. Right? So why do we do what we do? Who do we serve? What cause do we serve? I mean, honestly, when you look at the Muslims in the world today, what do they really serve? Yeah, personal interest. It is truly unbelievable how much we have, yet how unorganized we are. And if people try to organize the Muslim community, they start, no, you can't tell me this. No, you can't tell me that. No, I don't want it. Who are you to tell me? We play this game. Wallah, we play this game with each other. Why? Because we're all serving our own independent goals. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept. But the Prophet saw it bigger. It was bigger. There was one goal, and that is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And, for us today, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. It pleases Allah when Muslims work together in that which pleases Him. There's this one da'i who is online. He's pretty big online. He's pretty big online. While he was doing his thing and growing his following, another Muslim comes on the scene locally in his area and starts getting traction. And so he says, initially, I became bothered by that. Like, this guy is going to make it more difficult for me to grow my following. But he said, I stopped and I paused and I said, you know what? Allah loves when we work together. So instead of going against that other person, he said, let me reach out to him and work with him. And now they too are always together, working with each other. They have done phenomenal work and their following keeps growing. In fact, their followers build on each other. each one gained the other's followers. That's ta'awun. That's the barakah that comes from at-ta'awun al-birri wa taqwa. Yet Muslims are so like, okay, we have our own group, we're just going to do our own thing. No, we have to think bigger than that. Because the Zionists aren't doing that. You have the Jewish Federation, right, that has organized the Jewish community. I don't mean this in any political way. I'm just looking at it in terms of institutions. They have organized the Jewish community, right? They interact with each other. They talk to each other. They're very organized. Well, we Muslims, until we're able to organize ourselves in a way that's meaningful, then we're going to continue to see this nonsense. So when the Prophet ﷺ says, إِن لَمْ يَكُنْ بِكَ عَلَيَّ غَضَبٌ فَلَا أُبَالِي, he's showing us the way we need to see things. Our goal is to please Allah. If it's through my masjid, great. If it's through somebody else's masjid, great. The same goal. And thus we work together in that which pleases Allah. And then the Prophet ﷺ says, غَيْرَ أَنَّ عَافِيَتَكَ هِيَ أَوْسَعُ لِي. The Prophet says, but afiyatak, I mean, your pardoning, wellness from you, just make things easier for me. It's more beloved to me. So take it easy on me. Make things a little bit simpler. And then the dua goes on where the Prophet ﷺ seeks refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But after this dua, what's the next event in the life of the Prophet ﷺ? Does anyone know? Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj. Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj. Allah is preparing the Prophet. It's one thing to another. It's all connected. When this happened, and when he lost Abu Talib and Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا سَيَجْعَلُ اللَّهُ بَعْدَ عُسْرٍ يُسْرًا. After this difficulty, Allah made ease for him through Isra wal-Mi'raj, where for the first time, it seems like for the first time, it is made clear to the Prophet that he is Sayyid Walad Adam. Before this, he thought he was just another prophet. It's another prophet like Shu'aib, like Musa, like just another prophet in the line of prophets. But at that moment, when he led all the prophets in Salah, it became clear to him that he's not just a prophet. He is the prophet, alayhi salatu wassalam. And so that's tafrij, that's making things a little bit easier on him, lifting his morale, and then going and speaking to Allah in the Mi'raj and receiving Salah and visiting the various prophets, taking advice from the prophets, alayhimus salatu wassalam jami'an. Inshallah, next time after Ramadan, we'll talk about Isra and Mi'raj and some of the lessons there. But the last point here is سَيَجْعَلُ اللَّهُ بَعْدَ عُسْرٍ يُسْرًا. Right? What we see going on is unacceptable. It's unbelievable. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does things His way. We have a role to play. And we must be tough. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَشِدَّاءُ عَلَى الْكُفَّارِ. We have to be tough. But if we're not organized, then it's meaningless. We can't be tough. A bunch of people shouting and yelling is only going to do so much. Clearly, 5 months of protest, I'm not saying don't go to protest, but 5 months of protest is not getting the results we need. So while we continue to do it, we need to make things a little bit clearer. There needs to be consequences for not listening to our voice. How do we do that? Well, we need to be more organized. Right? So we'll stop there. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Inshallah, we will reconvene after Ramadan. As'alullah an yubarik lakum fi Ramadan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless your Ramadan that's upcoming. Inshallah, we hope to see you throughout the month. Wa jazakumullahu khairan.